Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Ellen Moore. I'm the mining program director at Earthworks. Earthworks is a nonprofit organization that works to protect communities and the environment from the adverse impacts of oil, gas, and mining while promoting sustainable solutions. Today, we are really pleased to be hosting a discussion with author and researcher Thea Riofrancos about her new book, Extraction: The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. So just first, a few housekeeping items. We hope to have time at the end to address some questions from the audience. So please put your questions into the Q&A box. And also the recording of this webinar will be recorded and posted online, and we'll send out a link after the event. And now we can jump in. Green technologies like electric cars and batteries require lithium, copper, and other minerals. Thea's book frames the current rush to expand lithium mining as more than the process of taking minerals out of the ground and putting them into global supply chains. She looks at the social and geopolitical implications, the conflict between capitalism and nature, and the tensions between frontline communities and huge corporations. We're excited to spend the next hour digging into that work. Thea is an associate professor of political science at Providence College, a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute, a fellow at the Transnational Institute. She's also the author of Resource Radicals, a book about Ecuador's battle over control of oil and mining during a historic government transition, and the co-author of A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal. Her work has appeared on NPR, in The Guardian, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and she's spoken at the European Parliament, France's National Assembly, and in numerous conferences and universities. Her new book, Extraction, draws on over a decade of research, fieldwork, and expertise. Welcome, Thea. I'm going to turn it over to Raquel Dominguez, Circular Economy Policy Advocate at Earthworks, to lead the discussion.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. Hi, Thea. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us about your new book. I loved it, as did pretty much everyone I've talked to about it. You can tell because I have gone through multiple pens highlighting stuff in here. So it covers a lot, both geographically and figuratively, but it's all bound together by your interest in the concept of frontiers and how dynamic they are. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in mining and mineral extraction, and relatedly, why you decided to do fieldwork in Chile?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to say to everyone gathered here, and to you, Raquel, how important Earthworks has actually been throughout this whole research process. The coalitional work and the research that Earthworks has done over the years have been like in parallel and intersecting with my own work in ways that I think have opened up a lot of important conversations, created new relationships, built new coalitions, and being able to observe that kind of from the early days of Earthworks' work on energy transition minerals has been just very instructive to me. So just wanted to share that. But let me answer your questions. And, there's long and short stories for all of this. I'll try to keep it on the shorter end, given that we have a lot we want to cover and we want to save time for audience Q&A. But I do want to answer the first part of your question, which is like what brought me to mining in the first place. And then I'll get in a little bit to how I came to this energy transition mining, so-called, and to Chile and some of the other places that I researched for the book. My interest in mining was really sparked in the kind of 2000s, early 2010s, in that era, when a lot of left-wing governments were in power in Latin America. And due to a combination of my family history and family background in the region, and also just the kind of cataclysmic events that were happening where social movements were organizing, progressive governments were taking power, and then there were a whole set of debates over like what does it even mean to govern from the left in this region, and how can you overturn honestly centuries of colonial and neo-colonial economic structures in the context of like a 4 or 5 year presidential term, and what kind of issues does that surface. And in those kind of heady moments, I learned that resource extraction was going to be pivotal to what those progressive governments attempted to do in power, but also at times the intense pushback and opposition they got from grassroots ecological and indigenous movements. And so this basic kind of set of conflicts or dilemmas became very live to me. Like, how do global South governments govern these sectors better, these extractive sectors, these sectors that are in many ways the link between their countries and a colonial history? And I know we'll talk a little more about that, but that challenge, and then how do you do that while also being sensitive to the fact that communities and movements have different expectations than they did in the past. They're much more knowledgeable about environmental impacts. They have more rights, or at least on paper have more rights. And that can create a situation in which communities and movements very understandably expect governments to do better, including like severing this entire relationship between their countries and this extractive model, right? And so those issues just were super interesting to me since 2010 or so when I first started researching them. But more recently, in 2018, 2019, I realized I wanted to shift that frame to focus specifically on the extractive sectors that were becoming salient for the energy transition. So my prior work had looked at oil, copper, gold, a variety of extractive sectors, but I wanted to zoom in on a sector that was relevant to the energy transition. Because as someone that by that point had also become a climate advocate, and maybe more specifically a Green New Deal organizer, working with local campaigns, working also in DSA nationally, in the Democratic Socialists of America. We had a big Green New Deal campaign at the time. I started to feel the sense of tension, like I'm advocating for a rapid, just energy transition in the United States. But I knew from my background on resource extraction that that would have implications elsewhere. Like, these supply chains are not just domestic. The kind of build out of this new energy system that I was advocating for would necessarily involve trade and relations with other countries and other economies. And I began to realize that there was a real risk that what I was advocating for would create harm elsewhere. Like, if I'm saying we have to fully electrify the US transportation system or decarbonize the transportation system and the energy system and every other system, what does that mean for the broader supply chains, especially at their most upstream point, the mining, which, as we know and you know from your own work, is oftentimes one of the most environmentally toxic part of the supply chain. So was I, in other words, advocating for like decarbonization at home, so to speak? Decarbonization is global, but with policies that would be at home, so to speak, and maybe environmental sacrifice zones elsewhere. And I just could not look away from that issue. Once I realized it, we can sometimes respond in different ways to issues that put our values in tension. We can run away, we can repress, we can endorse simplistic kind of answers that are black and white, and double down on one aspect but kind of ignore the other. And I could not, for whatever reason of personality, intellect, also my very real relationships across these environmental and climate movements and across borders. I just didn't feel comfortable with ignoring the topic. And so I decided that this would be my next research. I would choose an extractive sector that was at the intersection of all of these issues of decarbonization, the energy transition, but also with localized impacts on environment and society. And that led me to Chile, because I was someone that, as I mentioned, already had this background in Latin America. And Chile is a number two lithium producer, number one copper producer, both of them considered, quote, energy transition minerals. And so that felt like a place to do this research. What was unexpected to me, I guess a couple things, and I'll just sort of close out my answer here. But one was just how intense these conflicts are. Like, when you go to the front lines, literally or figuratively, like whether I'm in the Atacama Desert where this extraction is actually happening, whether I'm in communities nearby, whether I'm in the capital of Santiago, but where there are organized environmentalists and indigenous rights activists that are also taking this very seriously, even though they're not at the literal front lines, or whether you're in the halls of state or corporate power. These are issues that are really salient and really divisive in global South societies today in ways that we're starting to see in the global North as we see more mining spread around, but I think have just particular resonance when you're in a place with that long colonial history and long history of mining. So that's the first maybe takeaway, just that to the extent that I was internally torn over different values, that didn't get solved by doing field work. Instead, I saw how live these conflicts were and how people with oftentimes good faith opinions could really deeply disagree, in addition to powerful actors acting in nefarious ways that we can definitely call out and critique in terms of mining companies and government officials that, were really not doing the job of governance, especially under the first government when I was researching there. The second thing, and this will be shorter because I know we'll pick it up later, is that I ended up totally unexpected to me not staying in Chile for my research. I did a lot of research there. I did multiple repeat visits over many months, but I ended up going back home, so to speak, to the US and also to Europe in ways I didn't initially plan. That was just me following the evolution of events as they unfolded. And so I ended up with a more transnational account that really showed me a lot of clear similarities across extractive frontiers and frontline communities, but also really clear differences of political economy and position kind of in the world system.
Thank you. That mirrors a lot of my own development and understanding of these things. I never would have expected myself to be so interested in supply chains. So yeah, but you start at one point and you can't really just stay there. You have to expand. Um, which is brings me to my second question. Can you explain the globalization trend that in effect offshored a lot of mineral extraction and processing and many other environmentally toxic industries to global south countries?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is kind of what I was implicitly referencing a little bit, that the starting point for my study, which at the time I also conceived of as an academic study, and what I ended up writing was a more popular facing kind of legible book that's not actually an academic book. So that was a choice I made to really pivot from more scholarly writing to something that was more accessible. But the other big choice I made, as I referenced, was to have a more varied geography of where I did this research. But the starting point before I, made that pivot was Chile. And the reason it was Chile was, as I said, there's family background, there's like repeated studies and solidarity work I've done in Latin America. So there's a lot of connection I have to the region, but it also reflected like a baseline assumption I have, which remains correct, but I ended up nuancing a little bit. The
Mhm.
baseline assumption is exactly as you stated it, that environmentally toxic industries tend to be, quote, offshored, outsourced, like across, borders, and tend to move away from the global north kind of centers of economic and political power and instead be relegated or cited in more marginalized countries or places in the world, right? And this is a typical pattern of inequality that has economic and ecological dimensions to it, right? And
Mhm.
so we can go back to the kind of origins of colonialism, which I mentioned briefly already, and think about, how did a country like Chile even become Chile? How did it get inserted into the world system through Spanish colonization, then through independence, right? So Chile did become independent along with much of the rest of Latin America in the early 19th century. But when it became independent, it was formally or technically independent, but in reality, it was remain in a deeply dependent position in the world system. So you had mining companies coming from the US, British capital supporting the expansion of mining. You had the kind of hegemons of the world system like coming in and saying, these are the resources we want. And the Chilean state was really amenable to, we could say it was like captured by those interests in certain ways, right? And in some way you can actually narrate the origins of the Chilean state as like part of the extractive model of development that state kind of supported and implemented. And this endures over centuries. Chile has like one extractive sector after another, kind of layered historically and continuing to the present, whether we look at the mining sectors, the copper and lithium I mentioned, whether we look at basically extractive forms of agriculture that are monoculture, monocrop, or we look at forestry, right? And so
Mhm.
Chile, like so many of its neighbors in Latin America, but also in Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, has an economy that was forged in colonialism and reproduced under what we could call like neocolonialism, meaning like the enduring inequalities that structure the global architecture of trade and finance. And so all of that is correct, right? Everything I just say, I stand by. And you can see it in the most cutting edge empirical research where scholars have demonstrated that countries like Chile and the global south give more to the global system in terms of raw materials and embodied labor and energy and land than they get in their own economies. And they also lose out monetarily. They're on like a losing end of an economic exchange when they export that stuff. What they import tends to be more expensive, right? And this has ecological dimensions. Like you extract a bunch of copper or lithium, what's left behind is environmental devastation, social dislocation, resource drain, because these are non-renewable resources, so the resources can't be replenished. And then the profits and the kind of value added development happens elsewhere in the economy. So this, has ecological and economic aspects to it. And my research, one takeaway from my research is a lot of that is unfortunately being reproduced today, right? With the most cutting edge sectors of lithium for lithium batteries and electric vehicles, a lot of these patterns of corporate domination, of economic dependency, of ecological injustice are not that different than they would have been 100 years ago, 200 years ago, earlier in colonialism, right? But there are two big things that are changing, and that's what my research also tries to be sensitive to. One is that global North governments are not only offshoring these toxic sectors, they also want them within their borders, right? So, literally, a lot of what Earthworks works on, especially in the kind of mining program area, like relates to the fact that there are frontline communities in the US that are being impacted by this critical minerals rush, so called, right? And so the mining is not only in the global south due to national security interests or the perception of what national security is. Global North policy actors, left and right, I mean, or at least across the bipartisan spectrum that we have in the US, and honestly across the Atlantic, meaning this is happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, it's also happening in our neighbor to the north of Canada. Governments are saying we want more of these nationally like strategic and geostrategic mines closer to home, which means that we have to think about ecological and economic inequality domestically as well. Like, who are the communities that are bearing the brunt of this new rush? What do some of those communities maybe have in common with their, with parallel communities in the global south in terms of the types of harm they experience? What is different, right? We don't equate north and south, and there are real differences in governance, in violence, and other things, right, across national borders and across the kind of north-south divide. So that's one major thing that has shifted and was a challenge to my research and a challenge to my way of thinking, and what literally prompted me to go to Nevada and go to Portugal and do research in, what we call the global north. Though I'm scare quoting that a little bit because indigenous peoples have really like a different view of what the north and south are, and those terms may not be that as relevant, from an indigenous perspective. So I want to honor that observation. The last thing that I would say has changed, compared to that typical pattern of the global south is like a massive extractive zone for the global north, and all the ecological harms that brings, is that global south societies and governments are getting more assertive in a variety of ways, and they are trying in different ways and in ways that sometimes are in tension with one another to upend that relationship, that global relationship that I mentioned. So we see a lot of efforts at what we could call like green industrial policy or green developmentalism or green sovereignty, even in the global south. Government saying, we don't just want to extract and export, we want to get more of the value added, the technological development, the economic development that can come. So that's interesting. Those efforts are uneven in their success, right? A different response, which sometimes can, be in tension with that one, is global South communities, especially in Latin America, but increasingly in South Asia as well as Africa, at times just rejecting these mines altogether and saying, I don't even, I don't necessarily care whether the mines feed into domestic economic development or whether they go to global commodities markets. I don't want this mine at all affecting my community. So global South governments and the companies trying to do the investment have to contend with much more militant communities that are very aware of their rights and very aware of environmental impacts in a way that has really increased over the past decade or two. So those are real changes. Not every mining project moves forward as planned. There are a lot of stranded assets out there because communities have opposed or for, other reasons. And not every global South country is purely an extractive zone. There are efforts being made at kind of supply chain development within those countries as well. And so I think we need to be sensitive to these nuances while we might retain a fundamental picture of global inequality.
Yes, to all of that. I, oh man, I wish I could ask like 30 questions just based on what you just said, but we already agreed on these. I'm going to keep going. Um, how do you expect decisions and rhetoric about lithium and other minerals that are used for greener technologies to change in light of the US government's movement towards war with, and this might be especially relevant today, China and or Venezuela and or Iran and or other global south or otherwise countries? And how has the broader national security framework laid the foundation for this particular round of extraction?
Yeah, it is really hard to overstate how important geopolitics have been both to mining dynamics around the world, including in the US, but also to energy transition and climate policies in ways that really have thrown me at various moments over the past few years. Not being someone that, as I came into climate activism, I didn't myself view it as like a foreign policy issue or a national security issue. I more viewed it as like an issue of like planetary survival and planetary kind of climate justice, right? But to see under actually the Biden administration, and a bit under Obama, but really much more under Biden, how in the context of like a Democratic administration, those issues of national security and climate action could be so fused was something that I had to grapple with. Like, what are the implications of this? Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What is it going to do to the actual climate justice issue that I care about? And so I'll say more about that in a moment, but let me step back and just to say a couple of broad points that I think are important to establish. One is that this national security framing of quote critical minerals is really durable and really bipartisan. It started in large part under the first Trump government, though there were some antecedents in the Obama administration, but that's me being a little wonky and detailed. So I'll put that aside. People can read the book, so to speak, but it really takes off under Trump, who we may or may not remember, though I know there are some critical minerals nerds like in the room, but he was the one, his government was the one to put lithium on that critical minerals list. And we might ask why. Like Trump calls all climate policy the Green New scam. He hates electric vehicles aside from his brief bromance with, Elon Musk and the kind of, Tesla at the White House thing. But otherwise, he's been really hostile to electrification and electric vehicles and climate action. And yet, from his first government and even more accelerated in his current government, he's really obsessed with what he calls minerals dominance. And within that dominance framework, he includes minerals whose primary use case right now is in the energy transition, right? He may not refer to that fact. He often talks about AI or semiconductors or data centers or military hardware as the real reasons that he wants the rare earths, the lithium, the copper ready to hand within the US. But we know from the statistics that, it depends on the sector. This is a little less the case with copper, but especially with lithium and rare earths. The main destination of those is renewable energy technologies, which he opposes, right? So that contradiction is interesting to explore, but it can't be doubted the fact that his kind of view of national security and of geopolitics has motivated him to take a really large interest in these sectors because he views them, I guess we could say correctly, because other national leaders think the same thing, as domains of geostrategic competition. They have become that, and he has escalated that himself. Under Biden, I said I wanted to return to that for a moment, and I won't say too much more, and we can do more in Q&A if we want, but there was a really interesting development that happened with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is that the Biden government and Democrats in Congress decided to really emphasize incentivizing national mining, incentivizing domestic mining, and not only to incentivize it in general, but to link government support for electric vehicle manufacturing or electric vehicle consumption to whether or not those vehicles, for example, had domestically mined content. So it was not just like a general statement like we want more lithium mines. They were literally codifying and financially incentivizing more domestic mining, kind of applying a national security framework to climate action, saying the reason we're doing this climate action is kind of to compete with China. And the way we're going to compete with China is by having coordinated domestic supply chains that rival China's coordinated domestic supply chains, right? And that could be a whole conversation unto itself, but it I think posed an interesting challenge to climate advocates, like and to also environmental advocates. Do we think that the route to climate action kind of passes through getting like this national security consensus, or do we think that that's really dangerous because it undermines the conditions of global cooperation, which is also needed for climate action, right? So I won't answer that question. I think my views are relatively clear from even how I framed it, but I think it's one that we had to grapple with in the Biden moment. Today, though, and this is just to close out, but to kind of bring in those more contemporary foreign policy challenges and threats that you brought in, we see a real doubling down, not of the climate security connection, but of the minerals security connection, right? And we see, fast tracking and deregulation to propel more projects forward in the US. And I know that Earthworks is like working with frontline communities around some of those affected projects. We're also seeing more like muscular moves, and two of those that I'll mention briefly. One is that we're seeing the US government taking partial ownership positions in a variety of critical minerals companies, copper, lithium, rare earths, but also some refining, some magnet companies, some recycling companies. And this is beyond what Biden did. So it's a little throws you a little for a loop to see a Republican in the White House that is intervening more into corporate governance and ownership than the Democrat did, right? And we could ask why that's happening. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not against forms of government ownership at all, but I do think that the governance is so weak that these transactions are quite concerning, right? Like, what does it mean for the Department of War, so-called, to own 15% of a mining company? And what are the implications for governing that mining project, for the broader supply chains, et cetera? I don't think it bodes very well under Trump, at least. So that's one kind of pivot that's been made, or one new policy change under Trump. And the second is the one you're bringing up, which is literal threats to invade countries in order to capture their critical minerals, or a more like soft power, but still kind of pushy version of that, which is sign a critical minerals agreement with us in order to get reductions on your tariffs, or in order to be like on our good side versus on our bad side. So a whole host of like soft and hard power tactics to develop bilateral relationships in a very classic mode of imperialism where you're trying to do a kind of resource grab. That's not new for the US of A. I hate to break it to anyone that thinks it is, but it is new in the contemporary era to do it so brazenly. And, but again, we have to be critical thinking. Some of these same pressuring relationships have some precedents in the Biden era, but it was less brazen, it was less open to the public, and it did not involve threats of invasion, right? So that is definitely new. But again, we see this increasing imbrication of critical minerals politics and policies and political economy of those sectors, and kind of geostrategic calculus and national security politics and geoeconomic battles. And we have to be really attentive to the ways that those can, for the most part, undermine any hope of good governance, rather than, from my perspective, being anything that will further the cause of, better regulation.
Thank you. As the climate crisis worsens and the likelihood of meaningful government action continues to shrink, especially, but of course not exclusively, in I'll use scare quotes as well, global north. What can we learn from the extractivism framework developed from Latin American activists, and how can we use it to advocate for rapid and meaningful climate action?
Yeah, so maybe just to establish some basic understandings of what these terms mean that I assume are not new to everyone, but could be new to some people, like this idea of extractivism. And maybe even if they're not new to anybody, people may have different understandings of what the word means. So I want to kind of unpack it a little bit and then answer your great question, which is, how did the concept of extractivism, what does that inspire in terms of our own practices and policy visions and coalitional ideas within the US? And what can we learn from this kind of primarily, though not exclusively, Latin American way of thinking about capitalism and environmental harm? So extractivism is a concept that was really first developed in Latin America. And I can say that with reasonable assurance because this was a big topic of a prior book of mine. And I did a lot of what we might call like genealogical research, meaning like tracing, where did this language come from? Who first said extractivism? Like, where did this idea? Because as I mentioned before, when I was in Latin America, in this very heady moment of progressive governments coming to power and then a lot of movements figuring out how they aligned with those governments or not, the word I kept hearing, and this was, in 2008, was this idea of extractivism. And I had not like heard that concept before. I knew the word capitalism, I knew other isms like racism, sexism, but extractivism was new to me. And then when I came back a couple of years later to do dissertation field work in 2010, 2011, this had like only intensified. More and more people in Ecuador in this case, but also in other countries around the region, were saying extractivism is the problem. These governments, as progressive as they are just reinforcing extractivism. There were even ideas of like extractivism with like a progressive face, kind of like a greenwashed extractivism, right? So the discourse was getting complex and very interesting to me. But as your question kind of, presents, I didn't hear this discourse as much in the US. I began to as time went on, but not at that moment. And so I was really curious, like, what do these folks mean by extractivism, and how might it affect how we think about climate and environmental organizing here in the US? And so what activists and intellectuals in Latin America mean by extractivism is, we could just call it extractive capitalism, maybe, but just to be more, to kind of spell it out a little bit more, it's a system of predatory extraction in which there are large scale extractive projects that have a really large material footprint, whether that's mining, whether that's oil, though often it's also applied to, like, let's say a large scale dam or a large scale energy project that has negative environmental impacts, right? Mega development projects, as they're also sometimes called, right? So these large scale territorially expansive projects with a lot of environmental impacts, a lot of which are both invested in by global North headquartered companies, encouraged by global financial institutions like the IMF or World Bank, and the kind of output of them, whether it's minerals or, an agricultural harvest or whatever it is often like directed to global markets. So the model is extract and export, and no further economic development of that resource happens in the country. And all of the inequalities I mentioned earlier kind of structure that whole relationship. And what these activists were saying was like extractivism started in colonialism, but it's not going anywhere because it keeps being reproduced, like with every new commodity boom, with every new like company that seeks our resources, with each resource that becomes salient, like it was copper, now it's lithium, right? And like, we're seeing just a reproduction of this over time. What I think extractivism helps us understand is the really long durée nature of extractive capitalism, which helps us understand why it's difficult to transform, not impossible. And I'm happy to talk about it. And I know there might already be some questions in the Q&A about what are some policy solutions here. So I'm not someone that just throws up my hands or becomes nihilistic just because a structure is really durable. But I think it helps us understand why even well-intentioned global South governments like and experts and likewise elsewhere in the world like struggle to really change this really durable structured model of development, right? And it was activists and intellectuals in Latin America that kind of made me understand that really long time frame. A few other things that I think we can take away from extractivism as a concept. Another thing extractivism does is help us connect localized struggles to like global political economy, right? Because for anti-extractive activists, like a single mine is never just an isolated incident, right? It's the outcome of centuries of economic development of a certain character, as well as very, up-to-date shifts in like global market structures or investment decisions or global North policy decisions or changes in global North consumption that drive a lot of what materials are relevant versus not, right? And so a single mine might need to be fought or resisted or transformed or negotiated because it has specific environmental and social impacts, but also because it is like a manifestation of a system that's actually global. And so I think it clarifies like why local campaigns can have national or global importance in a way that, maybe I didn't understand as well before learning this concept and the kind of organizing strategies that it inspires. And I think the last thing I'll say, on this point is that extractivism as a concept, as a kind of also set of movements that seek to resist that extractivism and transform it, really made me like think critically and held me accountable in thinking through what is a just energy transition. Like a just energy transition, if we think about that globally, or supply chain justice, another concept I bring up in the book, I think needs like is not just about better governance in the global south, which is, oftentimes when we think about what are the problems with mining and different NGOs, including Earthworks, including all of our colleagues and comrades in a variety of NGOs, like when we think about how can we improve mining, we often go to the country and we say, okay, this country's laws should be better, or like this governance, or the local community should be involved, or rights should be enforced. All things I completely agree with, right? But there's a way in which, like, and this is a scholarly term, but there's like a methodological nationalism to that, meaning we just look within the boundaries of a country and we say, this country should have better governance. But what extractivism calls our attention to is like these relationships are transnational, they're global, they connect the US to Latin America. It's not some weird accident or some weird exotic problem of like this or that place, why mining has these impacts. It's due to a global system of capitalism we can name, like that propels really rapacious levels of resource use and doesn't allow places with these resource and extractive frontiers to have any kind of equal seat at the table in terms of governing those sectors at a global scale, right? And so I think extractivism like doesn't let us off the hook in thinking that, oh, things are bad or this or that country because this or that government develop the wrong policy, which again may be true in the specific instance, but is not actually a satisfying or rigorous explanation for why extraction is so environmentally impactful, has the specific scale and contours that it does, and has been associated also with so much direct violence. Like we need to think at a global scale to answer that, and also think about the relationships between North and South to answer that.
Hmm. Yes. I will, yes, yes to all of that. So we're going to switch to audience questions now, and it will probably not shock you at all to know multiple people have asked about solutions.
Yes, I'm happy
Um,
to go there. I love the
yes,
question. Yeah, so do you want me to speak to solutions like US based, kind of like how to design our energy transition better, or more like solutions like governance solutions across extractive frontiers, or both of those, or what do you think?
I'd honestly love to hear more about something you talked about in, I think, the last chapter of the book, which
Yeah,
is
sure.
where you were saying you came back, I think, from one of your trips to Chile, and you were like, what what am I advocating for? Is it like, where do I want my place in this to be? And you
Yeah,
talk about a particular report you put out with the Climate and Community Institute, which I know in my own work has been really, really impactful, because
yeah,
you talk about how uh, and under one scenario, we can reduce what, like 92% of lithium demand with X, Y, and Z policies under this. So I would love to hear more about not only the specific policy solutions you're thinking of, but also the ways in which you are trying to build a new world. And you're thinking about the political imagination we need to
yeah.
achieve.
Yeah. So yes, I do see a lot of questions on this front. And there is a as you mentioned, the final chapter of the book is all about solutions, but from an angle that may not always be the expected one. Because the way that I think of this problem is that at least in our analysis, as well as in our policy prescriptions, we need to think across the whole supply chain, right? Meaning, if the reason that there's so much demand for new lithium emanates from the fact that we have a kind of approach to decarbonizing our transportation system that focuses on individual passenger vehicles, individual passenger electric vehicles. And we know that, if there's a lot of individual car purchases, that is a lot more resources, potential. I shouldn't say we know, but we can hypothesize that it's a lot more potential resources than if we had a lot of people in the same electric bus, for example, right? Even if that bus battery is a bit bigger than like the battery in a sedan, many more people are served by it. And I started to think this way from in the Atacama Desert itself. I started to think like, is there a way to avoid the most alarming forecasts. And I see some people mentioning these in the Q&A of how many mines. Like, okay, one alarming forecast is that in the next decade, we need 400 new mines just for battery materials, not for the whole car, not the steel and aluminum, not for the motor and the rare earths, just for the battery, nothing else about the car, 400 new mines in 10 years, right? And then we can game that out to solar panels, to the car body, to the electric motor and the rare earths, to transmission lines. And it gets a little overwhelming. It's a lot. And so what I started to hypothesize is like, is there a way in which shifting transportation and mobility habits within the global north, and we could say within anywhere in the world, but again, I'm situated in my positionality in the global north, could we reduce how much extraction is needed over the next decades to come? And what I discovered very quickly is that no one had asked that question, or if they'd asked it, they'd never produced like public research on it, because Google Scholar and, all of the big academic databases, I couldn't find a single journal article or think tank report that asked that question. There was, and I want to name this because I'm at Earthworks report that came out kind of in this period that was looking specifically at recycling, right? So that was a really important foray into demand reduction, but the piece about changing mobility habits wasn't in that report, right? And so anyway, I get involved with the Climate and Community Institute, a great think tank that takes a progressive view of political economy and climate issues. And we developed this study in collaboration with UC Davis and actually showed empirically through quantitative analysis supported by a bunch of qualitative case studies that over the next few decades, from the present to 2050, we have actually a really wide range of scenarios of how much mining is needed to get to zero emissions. We could continue on a status quo where, again, it's a big focus on individual cars. We could get worse than the status quo, meaning like we could have the expectation that everyone has an e-Hummer, right? And so it's not just individual cars, they're like enormous individual cars, right? We could have expectations that actually we move some percentage of Americans into mass transit, into denser and more walkable communities, that we encourage more recycling, that our batteries are more normal size rather than US size. US batteries for EVs are twice the global average and twice what they were even a decade ago in size, which means a lot more raw materials. So we played around with all of these parameters that honestly, prior experts had not thought to include. And we came out with some results that were so interesting that even I was surprised despite, my initial hypothesis, which is that between 2023, I think it was the first year we modeled, and 2050, we can get to zero emissions with 66% less lithium mining overall, worst case to best case scenario. So best case scenario, as I said, Americans start to drive more normal size vehicles. We encourage more mass transit so that we can reduce vehicle ownership as well. We have some more density of metropolitan regions and we have more recycling. All of that leads to like 60%, 66% less mining overall across all those years than if we had the worst case scenario, like lots of exurban sprawl, lots of e-Hummers, like that whole thing, right? So that's amazing enough. Then in the last year we modeled, we just zoom in on 2050, which is our final year where we fully achieve zero emission transport, the whole thing. In that year, we have a 92% spread between best and worst case, right? Dramatic decrease. And going back to Earthworks pioneering work on this, like that's in part because by 2050, we have a lot more recycling feedstock in the system and we can really leverage circularity, where earlier in the model, like we're still having new mining because we don't yet have the sufficient recycled feedstock to feed into the system, right? So that was like, I want to say a path-breaking study, but it also just really blew my mind open about how much choices at the other end of the supply chain drive volumes of extraction in extractive frontiers and extractive zones around the world, right? And how intimate that connection is between models of production and consumption and the kind of their extractive requirements. Can I say one more word about solutions that is not on the piece about demand reduction, but more on the piece about governance? Just briefly for now, because I'm probably speaking to the choir a little bit here, but I want to emphasize how important rights enforcement is to good governance. And we just don't make that connection enough. There's a lot of great governance ideas out there, right, around transparency, which are great, transparency of those supply chains, right? Transparency of state kind of corporate dealings that are often like in back doors, right? There's other governance initiatives that relate more to industrial policy and trade policy. Like how can we, in the global south context, leverage a copper deposit into something more like broad-based development versus an extractive model of development, right? So I support all of those ideas, but I think it's important to start with where the problems originate, which is in the way that the state and corporations treat communities that are affected by extractive projects. And, it's important to emphasize, and this thanks to our friends at Global Witness, that and our friends at the Business and Human Rights Research Center, sorry, maybe I confused that acronym, but something like that. Both of those entities put out great reporting on human rights allegations, violations, and outright deaths of environmental defenders. And what we see time and again is that the mining sector is number one in the world for the number of people that are killed in protest and in basic human rights defense and in nonviolent civil resistance, right? And it's just extremely alarming. And right now, and I see some questions in the chat about geography and my focus on Latin America. Latin America in the current statistics stands out as the where the most of these deaths and human rights allegations take place. However, when I've interviewed folks at Global Witness and elsewhere, there is sometimes a concern that there's an undercount in Africa due to like what is the infrastructure around human rights reporting and ombudsman and where they're getting this data, right? So we might be underrepresenting deaths elsewhere, but the picture is alarming enough as is, which is a lot of people are killed in confrontations with mining companies. And so we need baseline rights enforcement to have just like a context in which people can share their concerns, ask questions, monitor these projects without fear of death or death threats or assaults. But also because like as Earthworks folks know, like local communities are often the best source of knowledge around potential environmental impacts. And if those communities live in fear, then we're not going to get good environmental assessments and we're not going to get good local monitoring, which means the whole kind of goal, ostensibly, of regulation is undermined by the fact that rights and kind of civil society participation is not being enforced. And so I guess I just want to give a shout out to the importance of having those rights in the first place, rights to prior consultation, prior consent, rights of nature, rights to ecological and environmental justice, but also like supporting efforts everywhere, including in the US, where this is also quite egregious, in like getting those rights to be enforced and making sure that governance is truly inclusive and not just this like backdoor thing between states and companies or really unequal bilateral negotiations between communities and large corporations.
Absolutely. Um, so many questions, so many good questions. But I get to decide what gets asked. So I get to ask, how do you distinguish between demand reduction and degrowth? And I would just love to hear some of your thoughts on degrowth as a concept. I know that is a gigantic question for a very little amount of time, but it feels relevant.
Yeah, no, it is a big question, but we can always take a stab and provisionally. So, on the one hand, there's not a lot of daylight between these concepts. Like the idea of degrowth is, I think most rigorously defined as an analytic approach that seeks to reduce the material throughput of our economic system, right? Meaning degrowth is not just like bring GDP down. That would be a kind of crude way to think about it because some of the point of degrowth is actually that GDP is not a good measure of human well-being in the first place, right? So like the opposite of that may also not be the best way to do things. Or we can think about during the pandemic when we had this a lot of pause in commuting and we saw this emissions drop, but like that's not exactly how we think about like bringing forth an energy transition, right? To have like a global crisis that radically reduces people's ability to consume or interact or participate in the economy. So I think degrowth, again, has this more precise definition that you're looking at how much material throughput of natural resources, of energy, of land is the kind of economic system we have, capitalism, requiring on a kind of daily basis in order to produce the goods that, capitalists decide that we need and that consumers buy and the whole thing, right? And I think that that perspective is similar to a demand reduction perspective, which is the preferred terminology among the kind of NGOs that work on this topic, which is let's reduce demand compared to some counterfactual of minerals, of resources that are required for the energy transition so that the energy transition does not double down on extractivism, right? That like we actually don't reproduce extractivism in the valid desire to get off of fossil fuels and get onto new energy technologies, that we don't kind of have a massive amount of extraction beyond what is necessary for social need or for the climate, transition itself, that is more to like pad profits or in a national security race to have like all the mines we can have here versus all the mines they have there, right? Like there are a number of geopolitical but also like profit imperatives that can increase mining above and beyond what is necessary to our actual goal of zero emissions, right? So in that sense, demand reduction, degrowth, they're like different words, or one's a more academic term or a more politically radical term. The other is a little more neutral sounding, but they're not that different. I think, what this question though calls our attention to is like, what words are useful in which contexts? And as someone with an organizing background of like actually being in rooms and knocking on doors and like being in coalitional spaces where my goal is to persuade someone that something is important, whether climate justice, whether the energy transition, whatever the issue is that I'm working on, everyone that's done that type of work knows that like words really matter and like some things land and some things don't land. Or sometimes your goal is like, let me work up to a point where this social setting I can get people to talk about degrowth, but like that's not my starting place because maybe your average American, even someone who's a climate activist, maybe hasn't heard that word before, right? So I think it's all about what makes sense in your social context to kind of persuade and agitate and mobilize people towards what your campaign goal is or what your pedagogical or learning goal is, rather than being rigidly attached to this or that terminology because it makes you feel good about yourself intellectually or politically to like use this label, right? And so I think it's about putting ego aside or sometimes our own intellectual or political development aside and thinking through pragmatically, I want to move this community on this topic, or I want to move this coalition towards this goal. What is going to work and what isn't, and being open to like experimentation and iteration in that process. So that was maybe went a little bigger than the question was asking, but I think it's a more general lesson because there's so many pitfalls in this conversation around energy transition mining and supply chains that I think we need to be graceful and generous towards our friends that are not fully with us yet, like, or haven't had this learning yet, but also like hold ourselves accountable to like what actually works to like move the dial towards a more justice oriented framing.
Yeah, absolutely. I only last year really got into reading about degrowth, and so I'm talking about it incessantly. So yes, I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of thoughts on like what audiences to use what terms in depending on your goal. You're absolutely right. And then kind of as a follow-up to that, do you link extractivism to degrowth instead of simply transitioning to green energies, but keeping the high level of consumption, as is what mostly happens in discourse and proposals? Yeah, I'll end it there.
So the question is about whether we need to change how we consume in order to is that mainly what it was?
Yes, I would say more specifically, do you specifically link extractivism? Like, would you say extractivism and degrowth are diametrically opposed?
Oh, got it. I mean, in a way, yes, they are. I mean, in the sense that, like, I think an orientation towards the economy and society that took seriously like what the kind of material foundations and honestly like non-human nature and ecosystemic foundations of our economy like that took that seriously is which is how I think of degrowth, or one way to frame it is not compatible with extractivism as I defined it. But maybe I'll just say one quick word about consumption, just because I heard that a little in the question, and it's a common question that I get, like, are you just telling us to consume less? I would say no, that's not exactly what I'm saying. And maybe I'll just add two quick thoughts here. One is that an important like modification of degrowth, again, whether we want to use that term or not, and I'm not really precious about language, as I just said, but whatever we want to whatever terminology we want to use. I think we need to always be clear about the class inequality of consumption. It is just not the case that all Americans consume the same or everyone in the global north consumes the same. And the transportation sector, believe it or not, is actually a place where we see dramatic inequalities in consumption, meaning like, and when I say believe it or not, I don't want to assume who's in the room, but it might be that whoever's in the room, probably might fly a little more than your average American. And I say that as someone that thinks about carbon emissions of flying, but I go to academic conferences. I do field work. So it's easy to think from a certain positionality that like everyone's flying all over the place. Not exactly true. Flying is very unequal. Even car ownership is really unequal, right? America, a very car dependent society. Even a working class person may be forced to buy a car despite it stretching their monthly budget. But there are people in the US that do not drive, and there is some definite correlation there with class status and like their income level, right? Or size of car, or whether you have a new car, an expensive car, right? So point is that mobility is very unequal, and that applies to every economic sector. And so when we think about degrowth, we need to include the fact that not everyone is an ostentatious over consumer of things, right? Some people are not consuming enough. They don't have health care. They don't have housing security. They actually, even if they have like a clunker car in their garage, they don't really have secure mobility because that car is expensive for them to fix, expensive for them to afford. When the gasoline prices go up, they don't even drive it. So we need to really think about inequality. The other thing we need to think about is that consumption is actually not individual. That's a mirage. It's a myth of capitalism and like individual consumer decisions. Consumption is totally downstream of public policy choices, the way the built environment and the infrastructures of everyday life are kind of designed. Do we live in a place where we're crisscrossed with highways, or do we live in a place where there's mass transit access, right? Those are really dispositive of the choices that individuals make, and as are the choices that corporations make about ensuring that their company is profitable. So maybe it's more profitable for a car company to sell an SUV. It turns out it is, and there's a lot of evidence that it's more profitable for them, which itself is an artifact of public policy decisions as well. But the advertising, the public relations, the marketing campaigns that go into selling certain products really shape consumer perceptions, right? So for me, it's never about telling an individual person, don't have a car or get this type of car instead of that, or just take a bus, even if there's no bus in your community. It's thinking at a collective scale. How do we need to reshape our society through political activism and advocacy to reshape the built environment as well as to regulate corporations differently such that consumers get to make the right choices? Because in a lot of the US right now, it's hard to make the right mobility choice, right? Because you don't have the mass transit access or whatever it is, or you live in a sprawling suburb and you live very far away, so you have to drive, right? And so it's thinking about what helps set people up to make better consumer choices, not about blaming the individual, in my view, at least.
I think that's a fantastic place to stop. I mean, I could keep going for like 3 more hours, but I assume people have plans and whatnot. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and for writing this book, and especially the choice you made. You mentioned earlier to make this like more popular book as opposed to a more like academic work. It's really interesting, and it is really important because I mean, as you'll see in the questions, like so many more people are starting to connect dots on this. They're getting more concerned about this. They're looking for solutions. And I think this is a really important piece of the very complicated solutions puzzle. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. If you look in the chat, you can find links to learn more about Earthworks and to buy Extraction by Thea. Anything else you want to say, Thea, before we go?
I just want to honor the fact that there are so many amazing questions that we didn't get to, including from some familiar faces or names. So I really appreciate the interest. I do a lot of virtual and in-person events, so folks can go to my website under upcoming events. Like this Friday, I'll be in conversation with some folks like Andreas Malm and Wim Carton and Wen Stephenson over like the global planetary emergency around climate. I may come to a city near you on this book tour. So I love the interest, and I almost feel bad we didn't get to address all the questions, but I appreciate them and hope to kind of continue the conversation in different venues moving forward.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a good rest of their week and rest of the year. It's the end is so soon. Thank you so much.